Good morning. Good morning. Thank you all for coming to today's virtual briefing to discuss the Government Accountability Office's newly released report entitled School Districts Need Better Information to Help Improve Access for People with Disabilities. This Sunday marks the 30th anniversary of the bipartisan enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. Unfortunately, 30 years after this historic law's passage, children and teachers with disabilities still lack access to education and workplace protections. As the GAO report found, people with disabilities at 2/3 of public high schools face physical barriers that restrict accessibility. These barriers have gone unaddressed, segregating disabled students from neighborhood schools where they may not be able to enter classrooms or use bathrooms. Schools often lack the funding and guidance to increase access for students, school staff with disabilities, and parents with disabilities. Regardless, the federal government has a clear responsibility to ensure that no student is denied the accessibility they need because of cost or complexity. That responsibility is even more critical during this pandemic. Schools are currently facing difficult decisions about reopening classrooms that will further jeopardize disabled students' access to equal educational opportunities. As another GAO report confirms, more than half the public schools need to repair multiple systems in more than half their buildings, even before the pandemic. To fix and update school infrastructure for all students and staff, the House passed the Moving Forward Act earlier this year. This legislative infrastructure package includes $130 billion to invest in schools to help schools safely reopen and provide all students, including students with disabilities, with safe and accessible learning environments. The Moving Forward Act is just one of the many steps that Congress must take to finally fulfill the promise of the ADA and ensure that our schools welcome all people and provide every student with access to quality education. Now, today we're joined with an esteemed panel of experts to help us discuss these steps and understand the GAO's critical findings. Jackie Nowicki covers a wide range of pre-K education issues as the director of GAO's Education Workforce and Income Security Team. Emily Seelenfreud is an attorney with the Disability Rights Advocates, where she focuses on increasing education and transportation access for people with disabilities. Emily Landau is currently editor-in-chief in the Rooted in Rights blog, a platform dedicated to amplifying the disability experience, as well as the host of the Accessible Stall podcast, which focuses on disability issues. And she will moderate the program after Ms. Nowicki speaks. Ms. Shamika Fields is a Prince George County native and wife and mother of two. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree in speech language pathology from North Carolina A&T University. She is a special educator for the early intervention population and also continues to advocate for her 7-year-old daughter, Madison, who was born with multiple disabilities. I will now turn to Ms. Nowicki, who will present the report's findings and recommendations before turning over to Ms. Landau, who to moderate the remainder of the program. We'll use the remaining time for questions, which you may type into the chat box. And finally, remember to keep your devices muted for this briefing unless you're actually speaking. We'll begin with Ms. Nowicki.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Scott. It's a pleasure to be here, and welcome to everyone who's joining us this morning. Thank you for inviting me here today. As we recognize and celebrate the 30th anniversary of the ADA, I'm pleased to discuss GAO's new report on physical accessibility in schools. While schools have made progress addressing physical barriers, people with disabilities often still face difficulties accessing schools and other public spaces. Beyond the obvious challenges for students and staff, lack of access can make it difficult or even impossible for people with disabilities to participate in basic civic activities that often take place in schools, such as voting, seeking refuge in an emergency shelter during a disaster, or simply attending a parent-teacher conference or a graduation ceremony. Today, I'd like to focus on our key findings from the report about barriers that may limit access in public schools and school districts' efforts to improve accessibility, and how the federal government can support schools in their efforts to improve physical accessibility in public schools in America. According to our nationally representative survey of school districts, 2/3 of school districts have schools with physical barriers that may limit access for people with disabilities. And about 20% of districts, which enroll over 16 million students, have at least one school that students with physical disabilities generally don't attend due to the number of physical barriers present. To get a better sense of barriers, the types of barriers that people with disabilities face in schools, we also visited 55 schools across 6 states. And while all 55 schools had barriers regardless of their age or conditions, schools that were more than 25 years old typically had the most barriers. These barriers most commonly occurred in main offices, restrooms, interior doorways, and classrooms. The types of barriers we observed ranged from bathroom sinks with exposed pipes that could pose a burn risk to wheelchair users, to heavy interior doors requiring 2 to 4 times the maximum amount of force noted in the 2010 ADA design standards, to signs lacking braille or raised characters. And while district officials noted that retrofitting restrooms to eliminate all barriers can be cost prohibitive, disability rights officials said that barriers in public restrooms, even accessible restrooms, are one of the most common challenges for people with disabilities. As a side note, I personally witnessed this last summer when on an outing with my dear friend Jessie, who uses a wheelchair due to ALS. She was at first delighted to discover what appeared to be an accessible restroom, and then dismayed when she couldn't independently open the exterior door handle, and then quite frustrated that the accessible stall didn't have enough room for her to easily maneuver her chair. We also found that even when school facility features meet ADA design standards, temporary barriers rendering them difficult to use were quite common. For example, we often observed doorways that were narrowed or blocked by items such as trash cans. These types of temporary barriers demonstrate the importance of school and maintenance staff being mindful about physical accessibility. Security features in schools present a particularly interesting challenge with respect to accessibility, and an area of tension often noted by disability and facilities officials we spoke with. An estimated 92% of districts cited safety and security updates as among their highest priority for school upgrades, according to our national generalizable survey. However, popular features intended to help harden buildings, such as heavy security doors and vestibule rooms that help control access to schools, can also create accessibility challenges, such as inoperable doors and insufficient maneuvering space for wheelchair users. We also know from our recent work on characteristics of school shootings for this committee that hardening access to school buildings would not have prevented the majority of school shootings over the last 10 years, as 60% of them occurred outside school buildings. Accessibility issues are daunting enough on their own, but take on a new meaning in the context of the challenges many districts would need to overcome to safely bring students back to school in person during the global pandemic. In a June 2020 briefing before this committee, I noted that an estimated 36,000 schools nationwide need HVAC updates. Many of the district officials we interviewed cited the need to prioritize these types of repairs and systems over accessibility upgrades, especially given the concerns with air circulation and COVID-19. The good news is that an estimated 70% of districts plan to improve the physical accessibility of their school facilities to some degree in the next 3 calendar years. And some districts we visited are pushing for inclusive spaces based on universal design principles, at times going above and beyond ADA requirements. For example, we saw some newly constructed schools that incorporated daylighting or natural light sources and acoustic features to help control noise in classrooms and common areas. And while these design features benefit all students, they can be particularly helpful to individuals with sensory processing issues. Regarding the federal role in helping improve the accessibility of schools, we found that the Departments of Justice and Education could do more to help schools respond to the requirements of the ADA as they relate to schools. We estimate that half of school district facilities departments either have not received training on accessibility standards or guidelines or did not know if they had. In addition, about 65% of the largest 100 districts, which enroll over 7 million students and operate more than 8,500 schools, reported that they would benefit from training on ADA and physical accessibility requirements. And although Justice has provided technical assistance regarding other public facilities such as stadiums, it has not done so for schools. We recommend in our report that the Department of Justice coordinate with the Department of Education to provide states and districts with online information, technical assistance, or training materials that are specific to public school facilities and that address the tension between safety and security versus accessibility. In closing, as we approach the 30th anniversary of the ADA, we would all do well to remember that millions of students and others with disabilities rely on school facilities for education and many other important civic functions, such as voting. The Department of Justice has an opportunity to further support its mission of achieving equal opportunity for people with disabilities by providing ADA guidance specific to schools. It is our hope that we will quickly rise to the occasion. This concludes my prepared reports, and I look forward to the panel discussion.
Is Ms. Lodow with us? Emily?
Yes, hi, I'm here. It's supposed to be passed on to Miss Seelenfreund next.
Okay, can you, if you could call on her, I'd appreciate it.
Oh, hello, I'm available.
Okay.
Good morning. Thank you all so much for allowing me to speak today. I'm an attorney at Disability Rights Advocates. We're a legal nonprofit operating in New York City, as well as in California, and I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the legal background for this issue. So as I'm sure some of you know, the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, has somewhat two distinct tracks. So it's clear that all new facilities that are erected after the ADA went into effect on January 26, 1992, those must be constructed in compliance with the ADAG guidelines in order to be compliant with the law. The issue becomes when there's buildings that were currently standing before the ADA went into effect. So Title II of the ADA makes clear that when a public entity chooses to offer its programs and services, either partially or fully, in facilities that were constructed before the ADA went into effect, those programs and services, when viewed in their entirety, must be readily accessible and usable by individuals with disabilities. And this has been interpreted to mean that entities, including school districts, must provide meaningful access to their services. Now, what meaningful access means is open to interpretation by courts. It's generally considered to be less than equal access, but as a practical matter, individuals must be able to access the services they're entitled to. And this emphasis on program accessibility rather than full facility accessibility was a balancing act between ensuring access to all public services, while at the same time providing public entities with the flexibility to choose how to make their access accessible. So the issue then becomes, what is the relevant service or activity, and what constitutes readily accessible or usable? So perhaps unfortunately, but unsurprisingly then, courts have held that there is no right to access programs or services at your neighborhood school. This has some wide-ranging implications. For example, courts have denied a 5-year-old child access to a school 4 blocks from her home, where she would be able to attend with her siblings and neighbors, suggesting instead that meaningful access is provided by forcing her to attend a fully accessible school 4 miles from her home. Courts have held that bleachers at football games don't have to be accessible because football is merely incidental to the program the school provides. However, other courts have held that when a school offers a unique program, all of those programs must be held in accessible spaces. In theory, this could be extended to auditoriums and science labs. High school musicals and chemistry experiments are unequivocally unique aspects of the school environment that must be available to all students. I would note that this doesn't absolve school districts of any obligation to improve access. On top of their program access requirements, they are also obligated to provide reasonable accommodations to both students and staff. There is a lot that can be done with a relatively small amount of money, and the law contemplates this and requires this of public entities unless they can prove that doing so would constitute an undue burden. To give a personal example, I'm a wheelchair user, and before I went to law school, I was a 3rd grade teacher. The building I taught in was mostly accessible, except my classroom had a back door through which I could not let my students out directly to recess. This back door had a large step. So for a long time, I would let my students out in the yard, and then I would race as quickly as I could around the front to make sure they hadn't gotten into any hijinks in the extra 2 minutes it took me to go around. Now, it was actually one of my students who mentioned how easy it would be to put a ramp in place. I realized he was right, and so I requested that the school accommodate me, and they did so. And I was amazed at how much that small ramp improved my teaching, and it taught my students a lesson in inclusion and disability activism. But the burden to ask for these reasonable accommodations is on the individual, as the law is currently structured. I wanted to shift gears just briefly to talk about New York City, the city where I practice in. It's a city where everything is bigger, including our architectural barriers. So my organization first became aware of this issue through our voting access case against the Board of Elections. In trying to implement the remedy in that case and trying to make voting accessible, we actually uncovered a barrier, which was widespread physical barriers at schools in all 5 boroughs. And that's because public schools are the primary location of poll sites. 50% of voting locations are schools. So what's happened is that the BOE is charged with making these schools accessible, but sadly only on election day. So what they do is they pay millions of dollars to install temporary ramps across voting sites that they then promptly remove after voting is complete. And we've been researching school inaccessibility in New York, and it's interesting to note that the DOE is actually relatively transparent with their data, and we're able to see how bad it is. Only 40% of the city's high schools are fully accessible, a rate of 9.7%. The DOE also has a second category, not a legal one, referring to partially accessible schools that they rank on a scale of 0 to 10. I would note that 76 of these schools are given a rating of 0 plus or 1, which means that the school doesn't provide access to a single classroom or restroom, which might be confusing to parents who see the partially accessible label and think that school might work for their child. And I'll note that none of this includes failures in other aspects of disability, such as lack of braille signage or visible fire alarms. The other unique aspect to New York City is that all middle and high school students apply to school because these schools offer specialized programs, which begs the argument that each and every specialized school must be accessible to provide meaningful access. Otherwise, the Department of Education is offering programs and services, whether that be specialized Latin or science, schools that are not necessarily open to students with disabilities. And another important thing to note is that these barriers don't just exclude students, they also exclude parents, teachers, and other folks who want to utilize the services that schools offer. We've heard from and provided assistance to parents with disabilities who face an impossible choice between limiting the schools their children is able to apply to or being limited in the participation they can have in their child's education if they physically could not get in the door. And I want to just briefly highlight a case we filed just a few weeks ago. It was actually an EEOC charge on behalf of a long-term teacher at a Bronx middle school. She's been teaching since 2008 and has not been able to use the restroom in her building since that time, putting her health at risk. So this teacher, in addition to not being able to use the restroom in her school, is also a very promising future school leader. She was actually included in the principals pool in the New York City Department of Education for promising future school leaders. But ironically, the trainings for that program were held at inaccessible school sites. This teacher quickly grew frustrated as job posting after job posting was not open to her. She couldn't apply because the position was to lead a school that did not provide access. And she became so discouraged that she felt deterred from even bothering to apply. And that's another important lesson here. Many students are losing out on an incredible principal simply because the DOE cannot accommodate her. Lack of access really harms us all, and it's in everyone's best interest to rectify these barriers. Thank you so much.
And now we have Emily Ladau.
Thank you, Emily, and hello, everyone. My name is Emily Ladau. I am a passionate disability rights activist, and I am a wheelchair user. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak before all of you today, and I'm so glad that the GAO has issued a report on this crucial topic. But with the 30th anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act approaching this weekend, I have to say that I do wish that a report on school inaccessibility wasn't a necessity at this time. You see, inaccessible schools have actually been a multi-generational problem in my family. My mother and my uncle both have the same physical disability that I do. My mother shared with me that when she was about to begin public school, there was discussion of which school she would attend in her neighborhood. Ultimately, she had to go to the one-level school because steps at the other school created a barrier. Although frustrating, this story does make sense in the context of a pre-ADA world. But 3 decades later, when it was my turn to start kindergarten in my local public school system, the exact same issue arose, even though it was the mid-1990s instead of the 1960s, and the ADA was already in effect. There were 5 elementary schools in my district, and the one nearest to my house had 2 levels and no elevator. So I had to go to the one-level school further away from my home. And while this may not seem like a particularly big deal, it was absolutely a detriment to not be able to go to the same school as kids in my immediate neighborhood. So from kindergarten forward, structural inaccessibility shaped so many of my public school experiences. I could easily take up the entirety of this briefing with personal examples of painful memories of inaccessibility, but there are just a few that I would like to focus on specifically. So let's talk about restrooms first. I hope you won't consider it too much information to know that almost every day of my K through 12 public school career, I'd quote, hold it all day rather than attempt to use the inaccessible bathrooms. And that alone should raise red flags for you. But then there was another elevator situation. Prior to the start of my freshman year of high school, my parents and I met with the principal. She showed us the elevator, which was a literal relic from the 1950s with a gate and a rattle so terrifying that the principal actually told my parents that they would be wise to buy me my first cell phone so I could call for help if I got stuck. I mean, that's a switch. Usually, principals are telling parents to have their children put their cell phones away. I had to have a cell phone for my safety. The elevator occasionally caused me to miss out on classes on the second and third floors of the school building when it would break down. So I spent some of those classes doing work in the guidance office unless I happened to get lucky and my classes could be moved downstairs to an empty classroom in time. They finally did install a modern elevator, I believe around my sophomore year, but I still find myself wondering why it took me coming to the school for that change to happen. I mean, shouldn't a safe elevator be a priority? Although the elevator issue was handled, there were other accessibility issues that remained. One particular recurring nightmare happened anytime I heard the words large group instruction room, the LGI. There were only two ways in: steps up from the first floor or a back entrance on the second floor that required me to go through the English department office and ask them to unlock the door. So if I chose the first option, I had to have classmates and teachers carry me up the stairs, which was absolutely mortifying and honestly a liability. Or worse, if I went in through the accessible entrance on the second floor, accessible being in quotes, I ended up being stuck at the top looking down at all of my classmates, but I was unable to get to them because of the stadium style steps. So any class or event or assembly held in the LGI pretty much made me want to melt into a puddle of my own embarrassment. And by the way, remember the lack of elevator that meant that I had to go to a different elementary school? Well, my mother happened to be flipping through the local newspaper just last month and came across an article with the headline Uplifting Progress: School's Elevator Installation is part of a district wide $30 million bond passed in 2015. The school that I couldn't go to all those years ago is just now getting around to installing an elevator to comply with the ADA. Can I appreciate progress? Of course, but I started kindergarten 24 years ago, so it shouldn't have taken almost 3 decades to fix something that the district knew was a problem. Inaccessibility isn't a minor issue. It completely colored my school experiences and interfered with aspects of my education and socialization. It's not something I would wish on any disabled student, but a 2014 report from the National Center for Education Statistics on the conditions of America's public school facilities actually found that it has been an average of 44 years since the construction of main instructional buildings, meaning that inaccessibility of public schools continues to linger far longer than it should. The good news is that there are legislative solutions that can support this work. For example, funding from the Reopen and Rebuild America's Schools Act of 2020, which is part of the Moving Forward Act, or HR 2, can actually be used to update infrastructure of schools to bring them to ADA compliance. And as noted in the fact sheet about it, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, public schools across the country were in need of significant investment to make up for decades of neglect. Clearly, one of those areas of neglect is architectural accessibility of school buildings. I hope that what I've shared today will compel you to commit toward working towards real change so that by the time we've reached another milestone of 30 more years of the ADA, schools will be truly accessible for all. Thank you. And now I would like to pass it over to Shakika.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here this morning. First, I would like to thank Ms. Julie from Millwood Recreation Center for reaching out to me and thinking of myself and my daughter Madison for the opportunity to work with Ms. Phoebe Ball on today's occasion, celebrating the ADA 30 years. When diagnosis hits for a parent, one of the things that's to the back of your mind is how school will play out later on in life for your child. You're so concerned about things that they need in infancy. For us, our reality was neurology appointments, casting, and a myriad of other problems that we didn't even consider the type of school or environment Madison would one day have to go to. So when she became school age, it hit us that she went to a specialty early childhood center, but when she was moving into kindergarten, would she be able to go to her neighborhood school, be with the people in her neighborhood, and meet and make friends? Unfortunately for us, that was not our reality. Our neighborhood school was not up to code or standard for what she would need. She would not have access to the library. There would be no access to the cafeteria. The space was too small for her wheelchair to be able to move in and out. And there was also a problem in the parking structure, the ramp in front of the school. It was almost non-existent. So luckily for us, we were able to stay at the early childhood center that she was currently going to school at from the age of 3. But this did not give her an opportunity to play and be around the children in our robust neighborhood where there are kids every day walking to school and, making friends. We love Madison School, and they have done a great job with making sure that she is accommodated. The bathrooms at her current school, they are wide enough for her wheelchair to go in. They do have rails for her to pull herself to stand to get on the toilet, but that's not every child in a wheelchair's reality. And searching for schools for her to go to for later on, such as charter schools or specialty schools in our area. We've applied, she's gotten in, but upon speaking with those schools, they did not feel like it would be a good fit for her. We were told that the campuses were too big for her to move about in her wheelchair. The elevators, the schools didn't have elevators, and that there were students before her that came in a wheelchair, but they ended up having to leave because they just could not take the back and forth of the big campus. So why is it that 30 years later, this is still a problem? This is why ADA reports that we've heard about this morning and things like the Moving Forward Act are needed so that schools can adequately prepare and have the funding to be sure that they are an inclusive environment for all children. When we went to a school fair for Madison to find one that could fit some more of her academic needs, there were some great programs out there. But at just about every table we stopped at, one thing they said to us was, we would love to have her, but unfortunately, we cannot accommodate a student in a wheelchair. So my hope is that moving forward, as time goes on, we get to a place where all children, regardless of disability, especially ones with physical disability, are able to be in a setting with all of their peers. My hope is that by the time Madison gets to middle school and high school, that there will be more options in place for her to be able to go to other schools in our area and not just ones for children in wheelchairs, because she is so much more than that. Thank you so much again for this opportunity to speak with you today.
Shakika, thank you, and thank you to all of our panelists for making such incredibly important points. I would now like to take a moment to invite questions in the chat, and while we give you just a moment to think through some ideas of questions that you would like to ask, I actually have a first question that I would like to throw both to Emily S. and also to Jackie. It is up to you who would like to go first. So the report discusses a number of different types of accessibility issues that schools have. And are there particular accessibility issues that are common that may be quote unquote doable in terms of not being terribly expensive to fix? So perhaps changing a door pull or removing temporary barriers so that they're out of the way. What are some solutions that we can use to create a more accessible environment without focusing on a very heavy price?
I can address that briefly, because I would say, and you touched on this, Emily, as well, restroom access is a huge, huge barrier. You see many schools in which the vast majority of classrooms can be accessed, and even with some small modifications, other aspects of the school can be accessed, but oftentimes it's the restroom that stops a student from being able to attend. And it's pretty easy to make a restroom accessible, and I would note that it's one of those things that again benefits everyone. Oftentimes you can make an all gender restroom that's a single stall restroom, and that really benefits the whole student body, because it provides a private place, it provides a place for students who may be gender nonconforming, it provides a place for students who may have other medical needs such as diabetes and may need to give themselves insulin shots. And so it's one of those things in which it really benefits the whole school to provide restroom access, and it's usually not cost prohibitive, and it usually, in fact, would be legally required as a reasonable accommodation for that student or teacher.
Thank you, Emily. Jackie or Shakika, do you have anything you'd like to add? Oh, hi, Jackie.
Hi, Emily. Sure. I think you're pointing out exactly the kinds of things that we saw in our work. Well, we didn't study the costs of these kinds of changes specifically. We did hear, for example, there's a district, a large district in California that we visited. They developed a rapid access program to address smaller or temporary barriers, like the ones that we've been talking about. And they did that so that people didn't have to wait for a large scale renovation to have sort of smaller barriers addressed. So there are schools out there, I think, that are making the kinds of steps that you're looking for.
Thank you so much, Jackie. I appreciate that. Shakika, do you have anything you would like to add?
Nope, not at this time.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, moving on to another question, I would like to ask, the report refers to the lack of information that schools have regarding their responsibility to make sure that schools are accessible. So what resources are currently available to schools to help them both ascertain their responsibilities and understand how they can improve upon accessibility? And is there anything Congress can do to make sure that schools have access to this information?
Emily, this is Jackie. I can, I can say that the Department of, there's a couple of things. So the Department of Justice operates, as you know, a toll-free hotline and website, ada.gov, that has general information on the ADA. The ADA 2010 design standards themselves provide information on physical accessibility requirements for public buildings. That does include schools. However, as you know, as we noted in our report, there were many officials that told us that, those standards are over 250 pages and they can be pretty difficult to understand and implement. And they did note that the need for more user-friendly guidance on how to implement the ADA successfully in schools. One district official put it as follows. They said, "We need a guide that does not take a legal or engineering degree to understand." And so that's one of the reasons that we made a recommendation that the Department of Justice provide clearer, simpler, more easily implemented guidance for schools. And, in terms of what Congress can do, sometimes it's always helpful when Congress encourages agencies to implement the recommendations that GAO makes. So that's certainly one thing that could apply here.
Thank you so much. And for our next question, we've been asked, can someone address the challenges of virtual classrooms, specifically the school's responsibility to ensure digital access or best practices to maintain digital access during COVID-19? And so I would be happy to take that question first, and then I can turn it over to any of my panelists. So in regard to virtual learning, we have to be mindful of the fact that accessibility is just as important as it is in the real world in a classroom. And so that can look like anything from providing captioning or interpreting services for students. It can look like ensuring that students have access to large print materials and ensuring that students have access to all of the materials prior to class. It's really, really important schools continue to work with every single student to provide accommodations just as they would if students were physically in the classroom. If we don't provide accommodations, we are essentially leaving students behind, which we cannot afford to do, especially not now. And I would turn it over to any of my co-panelists if they'd like to add specific examples.
Hi, I can give an example of that. So during the distance learning time period for Madison, her school had been really doing a good job of making sure that her accommodations were still in place. I think the biggest thing, especially as a parent, was making sure that her teacher knew that even though we are distance learning now, she still can receive her extra time. She can still get her materials a little bit ahead of time. I think her case manager did an amazing job of hosting breakout Zoom sessions for her, giving her supplemental work to the classroom, the supplementary services that she had, such as physical therapy, occupational therapy. They reached out to me the amount of times that was allotted in her IEP to be able to talk to us, give us tips for positioning her at home, and to make the learning process a lot better, even offering for us to pick up some of those materials that were left at school for her. Even her adapted PE teacher would send me like workouts for her every week. So I would say that it is the responsibility of the school. And, you know, as parents, we have to know that they are still being held accountable for all of their modifications and accommodations to be put in place, even in a virtual learning setting.
Thank you so much. And Jackie or Emily S., do you have anything you'd like to add around the challenges of virtual classes and accessibility during this time?
Emily, I would just add that we are actually in the process of conducting some preliminary work. We plan on reporting out in the very early fall on some of the experiences and issues with distance learning this past spring that students with disabilities and also English learners are facing. So we don't have any information to share on that now, but in just maybe, what is it, the end of July, within 2.5 short months, we will have a report coming out that addresses some preliminary observations on this topic.
Thank you, Jackie. Emily S., anything to add?
Yeah, I would just add that most of this is actually covered under a separate law, the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And we've heard from a lot of parents, while they're technically, this law doesn't contemplate services not being provided for any act of God or anything like that. So students should still be legally obligated to receive the services that are in their IEPs. And we've heard anecdotally from a lot of parents that they're being encouraged to not opt into virtual services. And there's a lot of fear that they won't receive these services when they do go back into the classroom. And the DOE did release some guidance from this in March, in which they stated that the need for compensatory services would be an individualized determination to be considered when schools resume in person. And a lot of parents that we've been hearing from are really fearing that their student is going to regress in these months of remote learning. And I would really encourage school districts to consider providing these compensatory services.
Thank you, everyone. And speaking of legislation, is there any further pending legislation that we might want to flag for everyone who's joining us today that would be most beneficial to the disability community? I know that, as I referenced before, there is legislation pertaining to COVID that will allow funding to be used to bring school buildings up to compliance with the ADA. Is there anything else that our listeners should be aware of? If not, I'm happy to turn it over to the next question. So, Jackie, I believe I can turn this one over to you. Did the GAO report address cognitive accessibility at all within the report?
So we did not specifically address cognitive accessibility. We were looking at physical access specifically. But we did find, as I mentioned earlier, that some districts have undertaken efforts to create spaces for students with, for example, sensory-related disabilities. Schools, I mentioned the schools that had focused more on natural lighting and sound-absorbing features. So that is one example that we heard, but we didn't specifically focus or audit around cognitive accessibility.
Thank you so much. So another question, which is particularly timely and pertinent, with the election just a few months away, would you say that this report has any implications for the accessibility of polling places, given that many schools themselves are actually polling places? And I will actually just take a brief moment to answer this. So on a personal note, the very same school that is just now getting around to installing the elevator is also actually my polling place. And so going to vote has always been an interesting experience because I'm going into a school that I know should have been the school that I went to. But on top of that, they actually lock the front door and have a side entrance right into the gymnasium, which is where the voting and the polling takes place. And so there is an awkward step up, but because I'm a wheelchair user, I am unable to get over that step up and into the gymnasium. So I needed to have my father, who luckily was with me, go around into the gym, ask someone to unlock the front door so that I could get inside so that I could exercise my right to vote. And you would say, great, you got in, you exercised your right to vote, but many people with disabilities go to do so independently or would like to go to do so independently without having someone else with them. If they're not able to get into the building, how can they exercise their right to vote? So we need to be thinking about the entrances to school buildings. We need to be thinking about the barriers, not just to students, but also to the community. And I'd love to ask if any of our other panelists have anything to add.
I can address that. I think I touched on it just briefly in my remarks. This is a huge issue in New York. We heard situations in which people were offered to be carried into the school building, in which the ballot or possibly even tell poll workers who they were voting for. And the court was unequivocal that to vote, you must be able to vote independently without any aid from others. But again, as we implement the monitoring for that legal victory, we see time and time again that the Board of Elections is putting in these temporary accessibility solutions, and it would really behoove them to work with the Department of Education and basically figure out how to make these temporary solutions more permanent so they can benefit voters and students. And the other thing I would note, this is a unrelated topic to physical access, but as we're seeing a push for more absentee voting given the COVID-19 crisis, there's a giant issue of paper ballots not being accessible for blind individuals. And my office actually filed a lawsuit against the New York Board of Elections, behooving them to make their paper ballots accessible over email. And I would note that military personnel and other people overseas are able to vote by email. And so it's clear that this would not be a fundamental alteration of their program. So it's just another thing that's really important to keep in mind as we try and make voting both safe and accessible for the November election.
Thank you, Emily. Do either of our other panelists have anything they'd like to add?
I would just add that I think the issues that we're raising here again just speak to the wide variety of ways that we use schools beyond educational purposes that we don't necessarily think about, and the number of people that are affected by physical access goes well beyond the students and staff and teachers who work there. The Department of Justice does have specific guidance and checklists on the accessibility of polling places. We have a wide body of work at GAO on accessibility of polling places, and it does discuss, that body of work does discuss some of the things that we've been talking about here. The number of impediments, temporary barriers that were stood up that maybe could be more of a permanent nature. I know that the most common barriers we reported on in our 2018 report had to do with steep ramps outside of buildings that lack of signs, lack of accessible pathways, poor parking or poor path services in terms of, getting into the building, as you were discussing.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I would like to transition to another question. Can you perhaps, Jackie, share a little bit about whether the report addressed if schools in areas of high poverty or schools that are predominantly made up of students of color, do they have more accessibility barriers than schools in areas that experience less poverty or are perhaps less diverse?
So we did stratify our sample in order to generalize to high poverty and low poverty districts, and also to districts where 75% of the students attending, or more, 75% or more of the students attending are Black or Hispanic. In terms of reported barriers in schools for those districts, we did not find statistically significant differences. However, I would say that, as we discussed in our report, many districts told us that they remove barriers as part of larger construction and renovation projects. And we know that poverty does play a role in the types of funding sources and the levels of funding that poorer or wealthier districts have available to them to discuss, to implement renovation projects in general. So there is a link there. In the context of the broader types of capital projects that schools typically undertake to address accessibility concerns, but we didn't find statistically significant differences in the, reported barriers in those school districts.
Thank you, Jackie. I appreciate you clarifying that. I have another question for you, actually, if that's okay. So, did the report find that there were less expensive accessibility features that can be achieved right away?
I think, like we talked about before, we didn't specifically examine the cost, but the types of, paying attention to removal of the temporary barriers that you and Emily were talking about is obviously a low-cost solution. Some of the more creative approaches, such as that district in California, and I think also just remembering that being mindful about physical accessibility among, for example, facilities and maintenance staff, I think plays into the existence of temporary barriers in the first place. That's certainly a not a very costly option for people to just sort of think beyond their own personal needs.
Thank you. And so we have another question regarding the fact that schools are now focusing on implementing greater security measures. And so, in doing that, is this at all impacting accessibility? And would anyone like to comment on the impact that security measures may have on accessibility?
I can comment on that just briefly to say, kind of anecdotally, what we've heard from folks is that often the accessible entrance is less secure because it often is a back entrance, sometimes through a bunch of garbage cans, sometimes poorly lit. And what we think is best practices and required is to install a security camera and to make that path of travel safe and easy to get to. And that would only increase safety and security for the entire population. And the other thing I would say, it's kind of somewhat related to security, is that as we look to be safe in this COVID era, it behooves all school districts to make sure that students are not traveling too far to go to school. And the problem with not requiring access to your neighborhood school is that requires students to be bused, often for many miles. And that both takes resources, but again, it also introduces that student to potential risk, and it makes social distancing more difficult. So it's just yet another reason why being educated in your neighborhood school is so important.
Thank you so much, Emily. I would like to ask if there are any further questions or any further comments from the panelists. Otherwise, I think we will wrap it up.
This is Jackie. I would just say to your point about this tension between accessibility versus security, this was an area that we spent a fair amount of time discussing in the report, and the fact that schools and districts need more information as they make decisions about safety and security in school. As our survey showed, safety and security upgrades are the #1 priority for the overwhelming majority of school districts. But our survey results, our site visit observations, and also our interviews with national disability rights groups really dug into this tension between potentially making schools more secure and the effect that might have on students and staff with disabilities, and improving the ability to improve physical accessibility. For example, there were a number of concerns that, for example, like locking mechanisms and certain barricades that can be popular in classrooms are not consistent with ADA design standards. And this is one of the reasons that when we made our recommendation to the Department of Justice, the recommendation directs them to promulgate guidance or make assistance available in a way that sort of addresses the this tension between security and accessibility.
Jackie, thank you so much. And on that note, we are actually going to wrap up today's event. I want to thank everyone so much for joining us. I especially want to thank our panelists, Jackie and Emily S. and Shakika. I want to thank Congressman Scott. And I would also like to direct any further questions to Phoebe Ball, and you can email her. That's Phoebe, PHOEBE .ball, BALL, at mail.house.gov. Thank you, everyone.